I just love how powerful this Floriani software is, and how with these updates we continue to increase its abilities and make it even more useful and easy to do things. And an example of that is in our refined properties box for dealing with compensation or adding additional width to objects. And compensation is generally one of those areas of embroidery digitizing that really is difficult for a lot of people to learn how to master and to pick the right settings. What happens is when we don't pick the right settings for our compensation, we get gaps in our embroidery, or we have it to where outlines don't line up with objects that they're bordering. And so it's very important to get it correct, and especially when dealing with objects that are side by side, like in this case. What you can see right now is I have two fill patterns, one red and one yellow. In my sequence view over here, you will see that the red object is the first object, the second one is the yellow. And so what that means is the red fill pattern is going to sew out first, and then the yellow fill pattern will sew out after it. And what happens is what area we need to be concerned with especially and is right here where the two objects butt up against each other. And what we need to do is make sure that we have enough overlap between the two fill patterns to make sure that we don't get a gap that shows up between the fill patterns. If we sewed it out as it is right now, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the 3D view. You see that they're right up against each other. We will get a gap if we sewed it out right now as is, because these stitches, because they're going in this direction back and forth, it's going to shrink in width, and this one will shrink inward for the width as well. So what you'd be left with is some fabric showing between the two. And whenever you're dealing with two objects that are side by side, it's very important that you exaggerate or add additional width to the object that sews out first. It's kind of like a little buffer that you're providing to make sure that you guarantee you don't get that gap. So you want to make sure that you exaggerate the first one. And to make that easier in the software, what we did is I'm selecting this red one, I'm going over to my push and pull properties icon here. We added the ability to change the amount of pull and push compensation added to each side. Because the stitches are going in left to right here, we know it's going to pull in on both sides. It's going to shrink in width. And then the push is, as it's going side to side, it's going to grow in height. It's going to push out on both ends. And so what we're going to do is we know that we're going to add our standard standard push and pull compensation to these three sides, but we need to make sure we add a little bit more to this one. And we want at least 1 millimeter. Generally it's even better to have about 1.2 millimeters of a buffer in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to our pull compensation tab, and we're going to choose an absolute amount. And the reason we're doing an absolute amount is because I'm going to tell it exactly I want 5 millimeters of compensation added to this side, and I want a little bit more to this one. I want to make this one more like 1. So you can see over here that you have the options. If you select both sides, it will change both sides by the same amount. So if I put 0.5 in here, what you will find, an easy way to kind of see where the original digitized line is to click on your shape tool, because what you will find is that it shows you that this is what you digitized, but these are the stitches extending outward. So you can see in here that if you go in here and measure, you're getting 0.5 millimeters added to the width. And that's exactly what we set it at over here in the pull compensation tab. But we know that we want a little bit more because we have stitches that are going to come and go directly over the top of the red fill pattern. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having it both sides, I'm going to click the first second. And what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to tell it on the first side, which will be the one over on the right, I want to add 0.5 millimeters, but on the second one I want to add 1 millimeter because I want a little extra. And so I'm going to select apply now, and what you'll find is, you hit the shape tool, you're going to now find that this is overlapped by a millimeter instead of being 0.5 millimeters. But if I come over to this other side, you will see that this one is the 0.5 millimeters. So this is a very powerful feature added into the software, because typically how you had to do it before is you only had the option to affect one side or the other, or both the same amount, but you couldn't have one side be affected by a specific amount and the other side by a different value. And so we added that in to make it easier. How you would have to do that before we had this option is, if it was back to the both, you would have to come in and you would have to move it a little bit more to give it that additional width. And so it just makes it really, really simple. And let me go ahead and undo that one. And I'm going to come back in my Properties tab. So if I was digitizing these two objects, if you know Walter's measurement theory, you have his book, you will know that he gives you very specific amounts to apply for pull and push compensation. I'm going to apply 0.5 to the first side and 1 millimeter to the second side. I'm also going to come in here and apply, because I know I don't need to change or have different values for one end than the other, so I'm going to apply to both sides 0.4 millimeters. I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to come down to my yellow fill pattern. I'm going to do the same thing, but because this one is the second object that sews out, I don't need to add additional in this area. You only want to add additional pull compensation to the first object here, because it's the one that sews first. These yellow stitches will cover it, and so it's always important that the additional amount gets applied to the first object that sews out. So let me go ahead and change these settings in here. I want to apply 0.5 millimeters to both sides, and for the push compensation I want to add 0.4 millimeters to both ends here and hit apply. And so let me zoom to fit here. So now I have two objects here, and if I turn off 3D view again and I come in to show this overlapping area, if I grab my ruler, you'll find that I have plenty of distance between these two, 1.5 millimeters, which is great. You have plenty of room, plenty of overlap to make sure that you don't see a gap, and to make sure that you don't ruin or cut your material. So it is a very, very helpful, very useful tool for those of you who digitize a lot and have to apply different compensation amount. It's now going to be so much easier to do, and so we're excited to bring this feature to you, this functionality to you, and we hope that you utilize it and enjoy it as much as we do.